Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name's John Underwood from the Health and Safety Executive. I'm just going to do a quick intro so that you see me and the other parts of the construction division of the HSE in context, and then we'll just go through a few little bits to build up and then talk about this new magical fee for intervention thing. So the structure of HSE construction division. It's important that you recognise that there are really four parts that you're going to come up against. The field inspectors that you deal with on a day-to-day basis are backed up by people from what's called the construction sector. Now, the field inspectors deal with the local issues, local sites, investigation, incidents, routine visits. But in order to try to keep a level playing field across the country, we have a body called the construction sector, of which I've got the lead for demolition, refurbishment and a few other things. So my role is to try and smooth path areas of contention, to make sure that the guidance is good enough, to make sure that we're working closely with the various trade bodies involved. Field inspectors are also backed up by specialist inspectors, and then for the really heavy end stuff we can call upon the resources of the Health and Safety Laboratory and indeed external consultants. So four separate parts, and you'll see why I draw your attention to that shortly. So what's changing in HSE? Well, you're already well aware that the control of asbestos regs has changed a little bit. We don't need to talk about that now, but quite happy to take questions or deal with points on those if the need arises. You can come and find me during the lunch break or after the event. Also, we're not going to deal with CDM, which is being revised at the moment, but you need to be on the lookout. There'll be a consultative document hopefully by the end of the year, and there will be some quite dramatic changes there. Now, a lot of what we're talking about today is driven by, obviously, the state of the economy and government's desire to reduce the cost of all public bodies, HSE not least. So, just to put it in context, HSE budget, 35% cut, and we wait to see in the autumn review whether we get any additional cuts. What that has already meant is quite a number of staff losses, office mergers, shrinkage, cutting back, which has meant it's been very important to put a lot more onus onto you using the website for access to information rather than talking face-to-face with someone. It means that we have dramatically cut site inspections of what we call a preventative nature, where there hasn't already been an incident, a lot more concentration on investigations and dealing with complaints. And it means, of course, cost recovery as of 1st of October. So I just want to add in, I'll throw in one little point in terms of what's changing in terms of public perception of the demolition industry. And this is really formalising something that's already existed for quite some time. And that is that here we're looking at the cream of the industry, the bigger players, the larger sites, but we have to bear in mind that with the update to the British Standard, which is now dealing with even the removal of one single structural item, the word demolition will of course increasingly be used and applied to small contractors who are not really what you would call demolition contractors at all. And that is something that we're faced with, and you'll see in the statistics that I'll put up in a mo why that is important. There's some advantages to leaving some smaller demolition works with a refurbishment contractor. It means that, for instance, if we've got a brick building, that we won't get everything stripped out in one go to enable refurb to commence. It means that we'll have a step-by-step, take a little bit out, add a bit in to maintain structural integrity and things like that. So there are some reasons why smaller contractors may choose or may need to do their own demolition work. And the statistics these are as up to date as I can get them, but the statistics, which I'm afraid, it's very crude, but HSE does tend to talk about fatals because that's the small numbers that are easy to get your head round. The statistics do include quite a large percentage compared to the full size of the construction industry, quite a large number of fatal accidents over the years that relate to demolition processes. But of course, an awful lot of those are with the smaller end of the market, certainly not NFDC members. And so far this year, we don't really see any change to those statistics. The only thing I can throw in is that if we take a 6-month block rather than a 1-year block, we are actually running about 20% higher for number of fatals compared to last year. Now, whether that will even out over the course of the year, who knows? We'll have to wait till the end to see. But it's still the case that the construction industry record overall is still about 5 to 6 times the fatal accident rate of all industries. So construction is still dangerous, and obviously where it goes wrong, demolition work is dangerous too. Priorities for the industry. These are the sorts of areas that inspectors coming to site to do a routine inspection would be looking for. All the standard stuff, and of course if somebody comes in to look at a complaint that's been received or to look at an incident that has occurred, these are the sort of things they'll be watching out the corner of their eye to be sure are okay on site. So I'm not going to go through the list, it's all standard stuff, you all know what's on that list. So the inspector's approach, there's no real difference. 90% of this is the same as it was before fee for intervention. The only change is the little one at the bottom. Intervene if standards are poor, inspection and investigation, checking how the site is being managed, how are things set up, what planning has been done, what is in place to keep people and the public, to keep workers and the public safe. Deal with immediate risks. Deal with underlying causes, including tracking back into other parties as necessary. If it's a client that's created the problem, then the client shouldn't be able to walk away scot-free. The overall aim, of course, being to improve duty holder compliance, and when the inspector is satisfied that things are okay on that site, they go. And the only time you see an invoice is if there's been this thing called a material breach, if the inspector's had to write to you. Yeah, come to that a bit more. So just to sum up what we've just swept through, what you're going to see as a result of cuts and changes in the way we work, you're going to see less guidance from HSE, less advice from HSE, because the people who head up HSE are now driving for more pursuit of poor compliers rather than less chat, let's help the people who are already pretty good to get even better. You're going to see more investigation from HSE. You're going to see a lot more inspection visits that concentrate on small sites. Now that, you'll be groaning and you'll be thinking, well, we're quite a big player, but on any individual site, we might only have half a dozen workers. You know, even a reasonable site, half a dozen people can do a huge amount in demolition terms. So you might be a little bit disproportionate to other parts of the construction industry. You might get more visits than you would expect. Fee for intervention is in. Can't escape it. We can't escape it. What it does mean, though, in terms of what I'd call the grey area, things, is this a breach, is this not a breach? It does mean that having standards set by the trade body, having guidance that has been prepared by the trade body and relying on that and working to it and being able to fall back on it if there's a concern raised, that does become really important, okay? So, fee for intervention, what it's based on. Those who breach health and safety legislation should pay HSE's intervention costs. Sounds fair enough. Those who comply shouldn't pay. Equally fair. So in theory, it is meant to encourage people to be compliant. It encourages anybody who's caught out to very rapidly get things sorted out, in theory. And what will be of most interest to your good selves, no doubt, is that in theory it helps prevent smaller companies, fringe parties, from undercutting you when you bid for small to medium-sized jobs, as a lot of people need to do in the current climate. So it's based on new legislation, or updated legislation, Health and Safety Fees Regulations 2012, new in. Can't levy a fee unless there's legislation in place that allows it, and that's what this legislation has just achieved. So how does it work? Well, it only applies if a material breach is found, and the classic examples that are given of what is a material breach is if there's an obvious risk of, serious injury, serious incident to either worker or member of the public. If there's no age protection and someone's up there and liable to fall off, material breach. Contrast that to if a particular poster that's a legal requirement isn't up, then that would be classed, as we've always traditionally classed it, as more of a technical breach that is relatively easy to put right, and the absence of a safety poster doesn't mean that somebody's about to be immediately wiped out or seriously injured. So there is a desire to kind of establish what are the areas that are easy to class as material breaches and try to define a cut-off point. And we're all smart people. We all know that the more you delve into something, the more you find grey areas. And one of the most difficult things now is for HSE inspectors to work to the same standard across the country. And no doubt it won't be very long before you start to hear stories of, well, so-and-so was caught doing this and they didn't get a notice, they didn't get a letter, they weren't invoiced for it, and so-and-so down the road, they were doing it and they have been invoiced for it. So what's going on? And what you will find is that if you have a contractor who has got really tight management and planning procedures in place and has got a good record, then they will be given more credit than somebody who has obviously got a poor record, doesn't bother doing written plans before demolishing, doesn't look after their workforce in any sense, so has a number of faults on a site like poor welfare, poor perimeter barriers to keep the public out, and there they are working at height. So somebody who is clearly taking the Michael is more likely to be pursued than somebody who's not. Okay? Difficult area, and it is obviously going to hurt a lot of people if you get one employee who decides to go off on a frolic and does something just at the moment the inspector turns up or the member of the public has their camera pointing that way, and suddenly you're being asked questions. So obviously, the workforce need to appreciate that, from now, they've got a role to play, a very important role to play in keeping your costs down and keeping your reputation high. So £124 an hour, not a good amount. It's actually about twice as much as it would cost me to investigate something and pursue something through court. If I take a company to court, then my costs for running a case through court are about £65 an hour, and you're being charged £124 if you're caught doing something wrong on site. So how do we put that into context? Well, if the print is large enough to read, £124 an hour gets you the salary of the person who's visiting, gets you a proportion of the management salary, a proportion of the support staff salary, HQ staff, office space, the IT, the travel time and the travel costs, and so on. So that £124 is effectively contact time, the time that they are spending specifically dealing with your issue or concern. And don't forget, that time doesn't start if you don't have a fault on site. The real nasty catch, the real sting in this, is that if you've got a big site and an inspector comes in and spends 4 hours going around that site with you, and 10 minutes from the end, they find a material breach, then you get charged for the whole time on site. I have trouble with that one. Most inspectors have trouble with that one. Anyway, we'll come back to that. If 2 inspectors come to site, you'd only get charged once because those inspectors are working together. The only time when you'd get double charged is if statements need to be taken, for example. One inspector goes off and takes 5 statements, the other inspector goes off somewhere else and takes statements off other people. Yeah, so that would incur 2 hourly rates. Our own internal specialist inspectors get charged £124 an hour, but only when they're doing something separate to what the initiating inspector is doing. So again, we try not to double charge just because the specialist is on site as well. Where it gets really nasty is if you have a bad incident, an unusual incident where we need health and safety laboratory backup, then they tend to work up a project cost, and that can get incredibly expensive. And likewise, if we can't cope with something and we have to go out to external consultants, then it's, you know, charged on whatever they bill us for gets charged on. So for a bad incident, the costs are going to be high, and there's no easy way of avoiding that. For a routine visit that finds something, you know, a little bit iffy, then, you know, what I'll try and do is give you a few pointers about how to keep the costs down. Obviously there has to be a process for appeals, and, you know, a lot of people, it won't hit you until you actually receive the invoice. So let's deal with it in that order. Invoices go out 2 monthly, trying to give a bit of distance between visit and invoice. In theory, you get 30 days to pay, but again, another sting in the tail, there is a debt recovery process. You know, the debts just get passed out to a recovery company. Glad to say that most inspectors don't have anything to do with that at all. There is an appeal process, and that falls into 2 categories, really. Well, let's call it 3 categories. Until the system beds in, you're going to be a bit aggrieved when you get a piece of paper demanding money. So the first thing you're going to do is you're going to phone up, because there'll be a helpline number. You're going to phone up, you're going to want a bit more information. So your first contact with the helpline and trying to get advice and get a concern resolved, that won't cost you an additional amount. Okay, so feel free to talk to them. There's 10 of them at the moment, 10 people full-time on this. Another overhead. The next stage is if you want to pursue it with HSE further and object, you know, you don't think it was a material breach or whatever, you don't think it was your company that was involved, that will need to be investigated further. And if it goes against you, then you will be charged additionally for that investigation work. If it turns out in your favour, then there's no cost to yourselves, everything refunded that you've already paid, but there is not, as I understand it, there's not a compensation process. So again, there's a sting to this, whichever way you look at it. If you get a prohibition notice or an improvement notice and you decide to appeal it, then I've been reassured, or assured, I've been assured that the cost recovery, you know, if you go over your 30 days to pay, cost recovery will not be pursued until the Employment Tribunal has finished dealing with the matter. Okay, so there is hopefully a bit of a sort of friendly work with you to resolve issues. Hopefully that will work fairly smoothly. And the other worst case area is that if HSE decides to prosecute you and you then win the case, you defend it and you win, then all or part of any money, fees for intervention money that you've paid up front will be refunded. But the argument goes that if you get hit with 2 charges and the investigation work in relation to both those is the same level of investigation work, whether there was 1 charge brought or 2, and you defend and you win one and lose the other, then HSE is probably going to argue that, you know, all of that investigation work was needed for the charge that was won. So, you know, you might not, in the end of the day, see any money back on that, even if you do feel a little bit vindicated. So, a bit tricky, and again, there's a bedding in process to see how this works. So obviously you're thinking, well, HSE is intending to rake in a load of money. I've got a view about that, but we'll come to that in a minute. But what's all this money for? Where's it going? Well, we mentioned 35% cuts to budget, and we've got, in 2010, when things got serious, HSE used to get from central funds about £230 million a year. The likely fund from central funds for HSE by 2014 is considerably down on that. And what we do get, what we have got for quite a number of years, is about £100 million levied on high hazard industries, you know, as was nuclear, which is no longer part of HSE, hazardous installation divisions, you know, chemical plant and the like, oil refineries. They pay a lot of money to HSE for the privilege of being inspected, and obviously government has now tried to filter that down and impose it onto the smaller end of industry, which is not going to be easy. But we've got a cap. The cap at the moment is set at £23 million a year. If we raise more than that, then the money, all the extra money goes straight to Treasury. So there's no benefit to us to raise more than that. But 23 million a year for the number of inspectors in the field means that each inspector may well end up having to be considering whether they're going to hit maybe about 8 hours. To cover 23 million, each inspector would need to be charging for about 8 hours work a week, okay, which is a day and a half, 2 days in the field. Whether that is a realistic way of looking at it, I don't know, because it worries me to think that maybe half the interventions that HSE inspectors were doing would be chargeable. Okay, I would certainly hope that half the visits that are made to NFDC member sites wouldn't be chargeable. I would hope it would be a much, much smaller fraction than that. HSE is committed to doing an annual fee for intervention report, so we will have to wait a year to find out how the whole thing's going. There's a 3-year legislation review and a 5-year sunset clause. So in theory, the legislation could disappear in a puff of smoke after 5 years if it's found to be not working too well. So what do HSE inspectors think of FFI? Well, you know, I'm not going to read through all of these, but fundamentally, I've yet to meet an inspector who's staying in HSE who likes FFI. It's generally disliked. It's a pain for inspectors, it's a pain for the industries that they're inspecting, and it creates a whole load of problems. we've worked incredibly hard over the years to build up good rapport, especially with the smaller players, the ones, you know, who are a little bit under the counter, the ones who are a little bit difficult to reach. We've tried to reassure, we've tried to build them up, we've tried to give them the opportunities to learn how to work safely. All of that goodwill is going to be out the window. Okay, I've already mentioned that you know, even before FFI, we were having to cut back a little bit on the amount of advice we could offer because we simply didn't have the staff to be able to talk and build people up. Well, it applies even more severely with FFI. It's a concern. HSE senior management know that concern, but are prepared to take the risk. Okay, and in terms of the incentives that FFI gives, well, we all know that very small contractors don't do incentives. They just put their head in the sand and hope they're not visited. So, not sure whether we can apply the incentivisation to the small players. So how do you cope with FFI? Well, the only thing I can say is that I've already heard that some NFDC members have been caught out. Don't know circumstances, but if you do get told at a visit that there is a material breach evident and that you will be invoiced, all you can do is try to make sure that you get the period that you're being invoiced for cut to a minimum. So by demonstrating good practice for preparation and conduct of work, in other words, good planning, good execution, by ensuring that the contracts make absolutely clear who is responsible for what aspect. Because an inspector who's chasing around, being bounced around several companies, trying to work out who was actually responsible, the hours are ticking by. It's in your interest anyway that everybody know who's responsible for what. By making sure that there is a paper trail on site, that the documentation is ready to hand, so there's not waiting around time trying to tease paperwork out of people. Yeah, keeps the hours reduced. And if you really do get caught out, then making sure that you're open and cooperative. It shows goodwill. It shows a desire to get things right, even if it might appear that all is falling about you. Being able to find and deal with the root cause of an incident and show management and leadership in getting to the core of a problem and putting things right. Not only does it show goodwill, but it means that the process is shortened. And the bottom one, high standard of visible process management equals less risk of fee for intervention costs. That is the bottom line, to be able to show that even if you've been caught out, that there's enough in place, that the management structure is so tight and so effective that normally this shouldn't happen, and what the inspector's seeing is an aberration. But unfortunately, we all know that on most sites, you know, what you see is what is there. If there is a problem, then quite often it means that that problem would be there a lot of the time, not just as a one-off that 5 minutes. And inspectors, you know, you won't pull the wool. No way will you pull the wool over inspectors' eyes. But you know where I'm coming from. That if the overarching bulk of your evidence is that things are tightly managed, tightly supervised, tightly executed, then you should be able to reduce the chance of being caught out. Now, I'm just going to finish off. Always like to have photos, and I'm sorry there's not more photos in here. Demolition News newsletter, Monday just gone. Not reporting on an FFI thing, but reporting on a case from, well, occurred just over a year ago, 15 months ago, just gone through the courts. And the comment was made, FFI, now we're going to get dobbed in it by any old body phoning up and moaning at us and getting HSE out there. And once HSE is out there, they're bound to find something wrong. Well, I don't want you to think that that is different to how things have always been. HSE is very experienced. Inspectors are always going to site with a complaint in their pocket, knowing that something's been alleged, and sometimes it turns out to be malicious, and we're very good at working that out and walking away. Other times the complaint turns out to be the tip of the iceberg. So let's take this example that was in the newsletter, just very briefly. 3 members of the public phoned up. No suggestion they're working in cahoots. It's 3 separate people. One of them emailed in 3 photographs. This is one of the photographs. So you can see an old pub being demolished. There's a reasonable looking site hoarding. There's site cabins to the right of the picture. Oh, and there's someone on the roof. There's nothing to stop them falling off the roof. Don't see any harness running line, nothing like that. Not sure what's going on there. So the complaint officer who took that information phoned up the company. The company was known. It was either a sign outside or a name on a van or whatever. And the demolition contractor, sole trader, who was on site, said, yeah, it's my site. Yeah, okay, I'll deal with the work at height issue, not a problem, all be sorted. Don't worry about anything, everything's under control. 3 days later, the inspector went to site, and you get that kind of thing. Now, slippery or what? When that guy came off the roof and walked out to meet the inspector, he was wearing a harness. Questioned under caution, the principal contractor said, yeah, well, he was meant to be on the roof with a harness on and be clipped onto something, but a loft hatch was so tight he couldn't get through it, so he took his harness off. Born yesterday or what? So there are people out there who not only have had advice about work at height in the past, but who will do jobs in full view of quite busy public areas with poor standards, who will not act upon advice that they're given by HSE over the phone, and when caught out, will try to wriggle like mad. And to cap it all, I mean, this clearly can only have been a fairly small contractor, because although we had seen him on various jobs over the last year, he had a letter in court from his accountant that said that his turnover was £7,000 a year and his profit was £2,000 a year. So devious in every direction you can think of. Right, so I'm not going to say any more. I've tried to give you a flavour of where we're at. You can tell that a lot of inspectors aren't happy with what we're faced with. There will be a bedding in process. I'm not so worried about you guys and routine visits. I'm a little bit worried about incidents and hundreds of hours of investigation time. But at the end of the day, if somebody's got it wrong and they're prosecuted, they would have been faced with a set of costs if the case was successful. So in terms of investigation and pursuit through the courts, there's not a lot of change. Now, I don't know, I can guess what your views on FFI are, and I am happy to do what I can to answer questions. I'm happy to talk individually over lunch or afterwards, so don't feel shy about letting me know, because I'm your voice piece in HSE and I need to know what your thoughts are so I can feed information back. Okay? So I'm going to stop now.
Thanks, John.